Crimson Painted Moon. Violet Tate had always known her family's ranch was built on borrowed time. But when her father's debt came due, it was Beau Slade, the most ruthless cattle baron in the county, who came to collect. He smirked, tilting his hat back. "Your daddy owed me a fortune," he murmured. "But I reckon you'll do just fine as payment." Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Bargain Made. The late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows from the saguaros, painting the dusty Arizona landscape in hues of orange and deep purple. Violet Tate, her hands calloused but steady, gripped the worn reins of her father's old mare, Bess. The air, still heavy with the day's heat, carried the scent of creosote and the faint, dry whisper of impending change. She could feel it, a prickling unease that settled deep in her bones, mirroring the gathering dusk. Her father, Silas Tate, had been uncharacteristically quiet all day. He sat hunched on the porch swing, a figure carved from the very landscape he'd toiled on for decades. His weathered face, usually animated with stories and laughter, was etched with a grim resignation that Violet had only seen once before the day her mother had passed, taken by a fever that swept through their small community like a brush fire.
"Pa?"
She'd asked earlier, her voice barely a whisper against the vastness of the ranch. He hadn't met her gaze, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon, where the sky bled into the earth. Now, as she rode back from checking the north fence line, a task her father usually relished, the silence of the ranch pressed in on her. The usual comforting sounds, the lowing of cattle, the distant whinny of horses, the creak of the windmill seemed muted, swallowed by an oppressive stillness. Even Bess, normally a spirited creature, moved with a subdued gait. Violet dismounted near the corral, the leather of her saddle groaning softly. She ran a hand down Bess's flank, feeling the warmth of the animal beneath her palm, a small comfort in the growing unease. Her father remained on the porch, a silhouette against the fading light. He hadn't moved. As she approached, she saw the glint of metal, a silver buckle reflecting the last rays of the sun. It wasn't her father's. A tall figure stood beside him, lean and imposing, a shadow stretching long and menacing across the porch. Violet's heart quickened its pace, a frantic drum against her ribs. The figure turned, and the setting sun caught the hard angles of his face, illuminating eyes that were as cold and sharp as flint.
"Beau Slade."
The name itself carried a weight, a reputation that preceded him like a desert storm. He was a man who built his empire on the broken backs of others, a cattle baron whose wealth was measured in land and fear. Violet had seen him only a handful of times, always from a distance, at the annual cattle auction in town. He moved with a predatory grace, a silent power that radiated from him like heat from a branding iron. "Evening, Miss Tate," Beau Slade said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that seemed to scrape against the silence. He tilted his hat back, revealing a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Your daddy and I have been having a little conversation." Silas finally looked up, his gaze meeting Violet's. There was a flicker of something there, shame, regret, and a deep, bone-weary sadness. It was an apology and a farewell, all wrapped in one fleeting look. "He's been explaining the terms," Slade continued, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, but with an underlying edge that sent a shiver down Violet's spine. "Terms?" Violet asked, her voice stronger than she felt. She forced herself to meet Slade's gaze, refusing to show the fear that clawed at her throat. Silas cleared his throat, the sound ragged and painful. "Violet, child, I owe Mr. Slade a considerable sum." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Violet knew her father had taken out loans, trying to keep the ranch afloat after a string of bad years, drought, disease, and the ever-increasing pressure from larger operations like Slade's. But she hadn't known the extent of it. She hadn't known it was this bad. "A fortune, to be exact," Slade interjected, his smirk widening. He stepped closer, invading her space, the scent of leather and gunpowder clinging to him like a second skin. "A debt your daddy accrued over many years. A debt he can't repay." Violet's mind raced. She thought of the ranch, the only home she'd ever known, the land that held the memories of her childhood, the graves of her ancestors. It was more than just dirt and cattle, it was her heritage, her lifeblood. There must be a way, she began, her voice trailing off. She knew there wasn't. She'd seen the desperation in her father's eyes, the hopelessness that had settled over him like a shroud. Slade chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a chill through her. "Oh, there's a way, Miss Tate. There's always a way." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, heavy with implication. "Your daddy owed me a fortune," he murmured, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing, calculating. "But I reckon you'll do just fine as payment." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She stared at him, uncomprehending, the world tilting on its axis. Payment? Her? It was a barbaric notion, something out of a dime novel, not the reality of her life. Silas finally stirred, pushing himself up from the swing with a groan. "Beau, no," he began, his voice hoarse with protest. Slade silenced him with a look, his eyes hardening. "It's settled, Silas. We had an agreement. A man's word is his bond. Isn't that what you always said?" Violet looked from Slade to her father, the truth dawning on her with sickening clarity. Her father had gambled everything, and he had lost. And she was the price of his failure. She was to be traded, like a prize heifer, to settle a debt. The vast, open sky above her suddenly felt like a cage, closing in, suffocating her. The wind picked up, swirling dust around her feet, a tangible manifestation of the storm brewing within her and the far more dangerous storm that had just walked onto her land. Her father's shame was a tangible thing, but so, too, was the glimmer of her own defiance, the faintest ember of resistance against the gathering darkness. The debt was called in, and the payment terms, delivered under a fading desert sky, would forever change the course of her life. It was the beginning of an end, and the cruel start of something entirely new. Chapter 2. Whispers across the barren fields. The ride to Slade's ranch, the sprawling Diamondback, was a blur of dust and despair. Violet sat stiffly behind Slade on his massive black stallion, the horse's powerful muscles bunching and releasing beneath her. The landscape, once familiar and comforting, now seemed alien and hostile, reflecting the turmoil within her. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows, making the familiar cacti appear as menacing figures, silent witnesses to her forced departure. Every jolt of the horse was a reminder of her predicament, of the bargain that had been struck without her consent. She refused to speak, to give Slade the satisfaction of hearing her fear or her pleas. Her silence was her only weapon, a fragile shield against the overwhelming power he held over her. She focused on the rhythm of the horse's hooves, the steady beat a counterpoint to the frantic hammering of her heart. She tried to memorize the passing landscape, the subtle contours of the hills, the sparse vegetation, clinging to the familiar as a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. This land was in her blood, and she would not forget it, no matter where Slade took her. Slade, for his part, remained silent as well, his back a rigid wall in front of her. She could feel the tension in his body, the coiled energy that seemed to emanate from him. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, to bending others to his will. She wondered what he thought of her, this woman he had claimed as his own, a prize won in a game of debts and desperation. The Diamondback came into view as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon. It was vast, even larger than she had imagined, a sprawling testament to Slade's wealth and power. The main house, a 2-story adobe structure, sat on a slight rise, overlooking the seemingly endless acres of grazing land. Lights flickered in the windows, casting a warm, inviting glow that was in stark contrast to the cold dread that gripped Violet. As they approached, ranch hands emerged from the barns and outbuildings, their faces etched with curiosity and a hint of apprehension. They watched in silence as Slade dismounted, his movements fluid and effortless. He turned to Violet, his eyes unreadable in the fading light. "Get down," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth or emotion. It was a command, not a request. Violet hesitated for a moment, her legs stiff from the long ride. She looked at the faces of the ranch hands, searching for any sign of sympathy or understanding. But they remained impassive, their gazes carefully averted. She was an outsider, an unwelcome guest, a living embodiment of her father's failure. She slid down from the horse, her legs trembling slightly. The ground felt unsteady beneath her feet, as if the earth itself was rejecting her. Slade didn't offer a hand, didn't acknowledge her struggle. He simply turned and walked towards the house, leaving her to follow. The interior of the house was surprisingly opulent, a stark contrast to the rough exterior. Polished wooden floors gleamed under the light of ornate chandeliers. Heavy, dark furniture filled the rooms, and the walls were adorned with paintings of landscapes and portraits of stern-faced men and women, presumably Slade's ancestors. It was a display of wealth and power, designed to intimidate and impress. A middle-aged woman with sharp features and a tightly drawn bun emerged from a hallway. Her eyes, the same cold gray as Slade's, swept over Violet with a critical, assessing gaze. "This is Martha," Slade said, his voice flat and impersonal. "She runs the house. She'll show you to your room." Martha nodded curtly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Follow me," she said, her voice as sharp as her gaze. Violet followed her down a long hallway lined with closed doors. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft click of Martha's heels on the wooden floor. Each step took her further away from her home, from her father, from everything she had ever known. The room Martha led her to was spacious and well-appointed, but it felt cold and impersonal. A large four-poster bed dominated the room, draped with heavy, dark fabric. A fireplace stood cold and empty on one wall, and a single window looked out onto the dark expanse of the ranch. It was a gilded cage, a luxurious prison. "Supper is at 7, Martha said, her voice devoid of any inflection. "Be on time. Mr. Slade doesn't tolerate tardiness." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "And don't get any ideas about running," she added, her eyes narrowed. "This ranch is vast. You wouldn't get far." With that, she left, closing the door behind her with a decisive click. Violet stood alone in the room, the silence pressing in on her. She walked to the window, her hands gripping the sill. The vastness of the Diamondbacks stretched before her, a dark and forbidding landscape under the star-studded sky. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and bitter. She hadn't cried when Slade had announced his terms, hadn't shed a tear during the long ride. But now, alone in this strange and hostile place, the dam finally broke. She wept for her father, for his weakness and his desperation. She wept for her home, for the life she had lost. But most of all, she wept for herself, for the uncertain future that stretched before her, a future dictated by a man she barely knew, a man who saw her as nothing more than a debt to be collected. Whispers of her fate had already begun to travel on the wind, she was sure. Across barren fields and beyond, the story of the Tate girl, taken as payment, would spread like wildfire. It made her an object, and the burn of it threatened to break her. But even amidst the wreckage of her life, a seed was sown. She would survive this. She had to. Chapter 3. A contract sealed in dust and regret. The heavy oak door to Slade's study creaked open, revealing a room bathed in the warm glow of lamplight. The air was thick with the scent of old leather, cigar smoke, and something else of faint, underlying sweetness that Violet couldn't quite place. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes that looked as old and weathered as the ranch itself. A large, imposing desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with papers, maps, and a single, gleaming silver revolver. Slade stood by the window, his back to the door, his silhouette framed against the darkness outside. He didn't turn as Violet entered, didn't acknowledge her presence. She stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, waiting. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Finally, he turned, his eyes, those cold, flinty eyes, sweeping over her. He hadn't changed out of his riding clothes, and the dust of the trail still clung to his boots and chaps. He looked every bit the ruthless cattle baron, a man who ruled his domain with an iron fist. "Sit down, Miss Tate," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. He gestured towards a chair in front of the desk. Violet hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked towards the chair. She sat on the edge of the seat, her back straight, her gaze fixed on Slade. She refused to show him any weakness, any sign of the fear that churned inside her. He walked towards the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He sat down, leaning back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. He picked up a document from the desk, its edges yellowed and frayed. "This," he said, holding up the document, "is the agreement your father signed. The one that details his debt to me." Violet's heart clenched. She knew what it was, had seen her father poring over similar documents for months, his face growing increasingly grim with each passing day. It was a contract, a binding agreement, a chain that now bound her to this man. Slade began to read, his voice a low, monotonous drone. He recited the terms of the loan, the exorbitant interest rates, the penalties for default. The words were cold and impersonal, devoid of any human emotion. They were the language of business, of transactions, of power. And she was the commodity being traded. As he read, Violet's gaze drifted to the revolver on the desk. It gleamed under the lamplight, a symbol of violence and control. She wondered if Slade had ever used it, if he had ever taken a life. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. He finished reading, placing the document back on the desk. He looked at her, his eyes narrowed. "Do you understand the terms, Miss Tate?" Violet met his gaze, her voice steady. "I understand that my father was desperate, and you took advantage of that." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or even amusement crossed Slade's face. He hadn't expected her to challenge him, to show such defiance. "Your father made a bad bargain," he said, his voice hardening. "He knew the risks. And I'm to pay the price for his mistakes?" Violet asked, her voice rising slightly. Slade leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "You are the price, Miss Tate. That was the agreement." "An agreement I had no part in," Violet retorted. "You are your father's daughter," Slade said, his voice like ice. "His debts are yours." The injustice of it burned in her chest. She was being punished for something she hadn't done, for a situation she hadn't created. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a game played by men with power and wealth. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Slade smiled, a slow, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I want what I'm owed," he said. "I want my debt repaid." "And how am I to do that?" Violet asked, her voice trembling slightly. He stood up, walking around the desk toward her. He stopped in front of her, looming over her, his presence overwhelming. "You'll work," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You'll earn your keep. You'll do as you're told." He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek. Violet flinched, recoiling from his touch. His fingers were rough and calloused, the hands of a man who worked the land, a man who knew violence. "You're mine now, Miss Tate," he said, his voice a soft whisper that sent a chill down her spine. "Remember that." He turned and walked back to the desk, leaving her alone in the chair, the weight of his words pressing down on her. The contract, sealed in dust and regret, was now her reality. She was bound to this man, to this ranch, to a life she hadn't chosen. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, a mocking counterpoint to the despair that threatened to consume her. But beneath the despair, a flicker of defiance remained, a refusal to be broken. She would survive this. She would find a way. The weight of his words and the cold, hard reality of the contract were her new beginning, however unwanted. Chapter 4. The unforgiving glare of Beau Slade. The days that followed settled into a monotonous, grueling routine. Violet rose before dawn, the sky still a dark, inky canvas, the air crisp and cold. Martha, ever the watchful guardian, would be waiting, her face set in its usual mask of disapproval, ready to assign the day's tasks. The work was hard, relentless. Violet, despite her years of helping on her father's ranch, was unaccustomed to the sheer scale of the Diamondback. She mucked out stalls, hauled water, mended fences, and performed countless other chores, her body aching, her hands raw and blistered. The ranch hands, initially curious, soon treated her with a wary indifference, their gazes sliding past her as if she were invisible. She was an outsider, a reminder of Slade's power, a symbol of their own precarious existence. The only respite from the physical labor was the brief, shared meals in the large, communal dining hall. The food was plain but plentiful, served in silence, the only sounds the clatter of cutlery and the occasional gruff exchange between the ranch hands. Violet ate quickly, her head down, avoiding eye contact. She felt their stares, their unspoken questions, their judgment. Slade was rarely present at these meals. He was a constant, looming presence on the ranch, overseeing the operations, barking orders, his very existence a reminder of Violet's servitude. She caught glimpses of him, riding across the vast expanse of the land, his figure silhouetted against the horizon, a hawk circling its prey. When he did appear, it was usually to issue instructions or to deliver a curt, dismissive reprimand. His eyes, those cold, unforgiving eyes, seemed to see through her, to strip away her defenses, to expose her vulnerability. He never raised his voice, never used physical force, but his presence alone was enough to instill fear and obedience. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of mending fences under the scorching sun, Violet was summoned to the main house. Martha, her face even more pinched than usual, led her to the dining room, where Slade sat alone at the head of the long, polished table. A single-place setting was laid out, a stark contrast to the empty chairs that surrounded him. "Sit," Slade commanded, his voice flat and impersonal. Violet hesitated, then slowly walked towards the table. She sat down, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the intricate pattern of the tablecloth. A plate of food was placed in front of her: roasted meat, potatoes, and vegetables. It was a far more elaborate meal than she was accustomed to in the communal dining hall. She looked at Slade, questioning. "Eat," he said, his gaze fixed on her. She picked up her fork, her hand trembling slightly. She took a small bite, the food tasteless in her mouth. She felt his eyes on her, watching her every move, assessing, judging. "You're not eating much," he observed, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I'm not hungry," Violet replied, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed. "You need to keep your strength up," he said. "You have work to do." "I'm aware of my obligations," Violet retorted, her voice gaining a hint of defiance. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Are you?" he asked. "I'm not a child, Mr. Slade," Violet said, her voice stronger now. "I understand the situation." "Do you?" he asked, his voice low and challenging. "Do you understand the full extent of your predicament?" She met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I understand that I'm here to repay my father's debt," she said. "That I'm at your mercy." He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Mercy is a rare commodity in this part of the world, Miss Tate," he said. "Don't expect it from me." The meal continued in silence, the tension between them thick and palpable. Violet ate what she could, forcing the food down, her stomach churning. She felt his eyes on her, scrutinizing her, dissecting her. She was a specimen under a microscope, an object of his control. Finally, he pushed his plate away, signaling the end of the meal. "You're dismissed," he said, his voice curt. Violet rose from the chair, her legs shaky. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Mr. Slade," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes questioning. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you do this? Why take me as payment?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "Your father owed me a debt," he said, his voice flat. "It was a business transaction." "But there were other ways," Violet persisted. "You could have taken the ranch, the cattle." He looked at her, his eyes hardening. "I wanted something more," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Something lasting. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain what he meant. He simply stared at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. Violet felt a knot of fear tighten in her chest. She didn't understand him, didn't understand his motives. He was an enigma, a puzzle she couldn't solve. And that made him all the more dangerous. The unforgiving glare she'd just endured was only a taste of the power he held, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that he wouldn't hesitate to use it. The dinner, with its suffocating tension, was just another layer in his deliberate campaign. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Life Left Behind. Weeks bled into months, the relentless rhythm of ranch life a constant reminder of Violet's lost freedom. The scorching summer heat gave way to the cooler, crisp air of autumn. The landscape, once a harsh, unforgiving expanse of brown and gray, softened with hues of gold and russet. The changing season mirrored the subtle shifts within Violet, a slow, gradual hardening of her resolve. The physical labor, initially brutal, became almost a meditation, a way to numb the pain, to silence the echoes of her former life. She found a strange solace in the repetitive tasks, in the feel of the earth beneath her hands, in the sweat that soaked her clothes. It was a way to connect with the land, to find a sense of grounding in a world that had been turned upside down. She learned the rhythms of the diamondback, the names of the ranch hands, the quirks of the animals. She even began to anticipate Slade's commands, to understand his unspoken expectations. It wasn't submission, but rather a pragmatic adaptation, a survival strategy. She was learning to navigate the treacherous currents of her new reality. The ranch hands, initially wary, began to show a grudging respect. They saw her resilience, her unwavering work ethic, her refusal to complain. She was still an outsider, but she was no longer a complete stranger. They even began to offer small gestures of kindness, a shared cup of coffee, a word of advice, a helping hand with a particularly difficult task. One evening, as Violet was returning to the main house after a long day of mending fences, she saw a familiar figure sitting on the porch steps. It was her father, Silas. He looked older, more worn, his shoulders slumped with a weight that seemed to have aged him beyond his years. Violet's heart leaped with a mixture of joy and apprehension. She ran towards him, her boots kicking up dust. "Pa!" she cried, her voice filled with emotion. Silas looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He rose slowly, his movements stiff and awkward. He opened his arms, and Violet rushed into them, clinging to him as if he were a lifeline. "Violet, child," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I had to see you." They held each other for a long moment, the silence broken only by their ragged breathing. Violet felt the familiar comfort of his embrace, the scent of his worn leather jacket, the strength of his arms around her. It was a connection to her past, a reminder of the life she had lost. Finally, they pulled apart, their eyes searching each other's faces. Violet saw the shame and regret in her father's eyes, the deep lines etched around his mouth. "I'm so sorry, Violet," he said, his voice trembling. "I never meant for this to happen." "I know, Pa," Violet said, her voice soft. She couldn't bring herself to blame him, not entirely. She knew he had been driven by desperation, by a love for the land that had consumed him. They sat together on the porch steps, talking for hours. Silas told her about the struggles he was facing, the constant pressure from Slade, the threat of losing the remaining portion of his ranch. He spoke of his loneliness, his guilt, his fear for her future. Violet listened, her heart aching for him. She wanted to offer him comfort, to tell him that everything would be all right. But she couldn't lie to him, not anymore. She knew the reality of her situation, the power that Slade held over them both. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch, Silas rose to leave. He looked at Violet, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Take care of yourself, child," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Be strong." "I will, Pa," Violet said, her voice firm. She watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the gathering darkness. She remained on the porch steps, the echoes of their conversation swirling around her. Her father's visit had stirred up a maelstrom of emotions: sadness, anger, regret, but also a renewed sense of determination. She wouldn't let Slade break her, wouldn't let him destroy her spirit. She would survive this, not just for herself, but for her father, for the memory of the life they had shared. The echoes of that life, once a source of pain, now fueled her resolve. The meeting, bittersweet and painful, steeled her for the trials ahead. The sun had set on her old life, but a new, defiant dawn was breaking within her. Chapter 6. The cold embrace of a stranger's home. The Diamondback, for all its sprawling grandeur, remained a cold, impersonal place. The vast rooms, filled with expensive furniture and ornate decorations, felt empty, devoid of warmth or laughter. Violet moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps echoing in the silent hallways. She performed her duties efficiently, meticulously, but her heart remained detached, her spirit untouched by the opulence that surrounded her. Martha, the housekeeper, remained a constant, watchful presence, her sharp eyes following Violet's every move. She rarely spoke, except to issue instructions or to deliver a curt reprimand. There was no kindness in her, no hint of empathy. She was a loyal servant of Slade, a guardian of his domain, and Violet was an intruder, an unwelcome guest. The other household staff, the cook, the maids, the stable hands, treated Violet with a wary distance. They were polite, respectful, but they kept their distance, their eyes carefully averted. They knew her story, knew her status, and they avoided any interaction that might be construed as sympathy or familiarity. Violet found solace in the small, simple room that had been assigned to her. It was a sanctuary, a refuge from the cold indifference of the rest of the house. She kept it meticulously clean, her few personal belongings arranged neatly on the dresser. A small, worn book of poetry, a gift from her mother, was her most treasured possession. She would read it in the evenings, the words a balm to her wounded spirit, a connection to a world beyond the confines of the Diamondback. One afternoon, while cleaning Slade's study, Violet discovered a hidden drawer in his desk. It was locked, but the key was hanging on a small hook inside the drawer itself, almost as if it were meant to be found. Curiosity, a dangerous emotion in her current situation, overcame her caution. She unlocked the drawer, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, she found a collection of old letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was delicate and feminine, a stark contrast to Slade's bold, scrawling script. The letters were addressed to Beau Slade, from a woman named Evelyn. Violet hesitated, her conscience warring with her curiosity. She knew she shouldn't be reading them, that it was an invasion of Slade's privacy. But the temptation was too strong. She pulled out one of the letters, her hands trembling slightly. The letter was dated several years earlier, and it was filled with expressions of love, longing, and devotion. Evelyn wrote of her dreams for the future, of her desire to build a life with Beau, of her unwavering faith in him. The words were heartfelt, passionate, revealing a depth of emotion that Violet had never seen in Slade. As she read more of the letters, a picture began to emerge of a different Beau Slade, a man capable of love, of tenderness, of vulnerability. It was a stark contrast to the cold, ruthless cattle baron she knew. She learned of Evelyn's illness, a slow, debilitating disease that eventually took her life. The later letters were filled with grief, despair, and a raw, aching pain that resonated with Violet's own sense of loss. She carefully replaced the letters, locking the drawer and returning the key to its hook. She had discovered a secret, a hidden vulnerability in the man who held her captive. It didn't change her situation, didn't lessen his power over her, but it gave her a glimpse beneath the surface, a hint of the man he had once been. The cold embrace of his home felt slightly less frigid, knowing that it housed not just her sorrow, but his as well. The discovery humanized him, if only slightly, in her eyes. It gave her a sliver of understanding. Chapter 7. Thorns among the wildflowers. The vastness of the Diamondback offered a strange paradox. Endless space, yet no escape. Violet found moments of solitude, however, in the untamed stretches of land beyond the immediate reach of the ranch buildings. She discovered a small, secluded valley hidden behind a ridge of rocky hills where wildflowers bloomed in profusion, a vibrant splash of color against the muted tones of the desert. It became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the watchful eyes of Martha and the ranch hands, where she could breathe freely, where she could allow herself to feel the emotions she suppressed elsewhere. She would ride Bess, her father's old mare, to the valley, letting the horse graze while she sat among the flowers, her back against a warm rock, the sun on her face. She would read, or write in a small, leather-bound journal she had found tucked away in a drawer in her room, or simply sit and think, allowing her thoughts to wander, to drift like the clouds that scud across the vast, open sky. She wrote of her memories of home, of her father, of her hopes and dreams, of the fears that gnawed at her. The journal became her confidant, a silent witness to her inner turmoil. One afternoon, as she was sitting in the valley, sketching the wildflowers in her journal, she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Her heart quickened with alarm. She quickly closed her journal, hiding it beneath a fold of her skirt. She looked up, her eyes scanning the ridge. Slade appeared on horseback, his figure silhouetted against the bright sky. He rode towards her, his expression unreadable. Violet felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She had been careful to avoid him, to stay out of his way, but here, in her sanctuary, she was exposed, vulnerable. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful. He walked towards her, his spurs clinking softly on the rocky ground. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes sweeping over her, taking in the wildflowers, the journal in her lap, the wary expression on her face. "This is a long way from the house," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I like the quiet," Violet replied, her voice steady. She refused to show him any fear, any sign of weakness. He nodded, his gaze shifting to the valley around them. "It's a beautiful spot," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. He stood there for a moment, silent, looking out at the landscape. Violet watched him, curious. She had never seen him like this, relaxed, almost peaceful. It was a stark contrast to the harsh, unforgiving man she knew. "Do you come here often?" he asked, turning back to her. "Sometimes," Violet replied, her voice guarded. He sat down on a nearby rock, his movements unhurried. He didn't invade her space, didn't try to intimidate her. He simply sat there, a silent presence in her sanctuary. They sat in silence for a long while, the only sounds the gentle breeze rustling through the wildflowers, the occasional whinny of the horses. Violet felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. It was an unexpected moment of peace, a shared appreciation for the beauty of the land. Finally, Slade spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "My wife used to love wildflowers," he said. Violet's heart skipped a beat. It was the first time he had spoken of his wife, of Evelyn. She looked at him, her eyes questioning. He continued, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "She would have loved this place," he said. He didn't say anything more, didn't elaborate on his memories of Evelyn. But the brief glimpse he had offered was enough. Violet saw the pain in his eyes, the subtle softening of his features, the lingering grief that he carried with him. The thorns among the wildflowers were apparent, not just in the valley, but in Slade himself. The shared moment, born of a mutual appreciation for beauty, hinted at a deeper connection, a shared understanding of loss, however unspoken. It was a crack in his armor and in hers. Chapter 8. A glimmer of defiance in the twilight. The shared, unexpected moment of tranquility in the valley didn't fundamentally alter the power dynamics between Violet and Slade. He remained the master of the Diamondback, and she remained bound to him by her father's debt. However, the subtle shift in their interaction continued, a barely perceptible thawing of the icy distance that had characterized their relationship. Slade began to seek her out, not to issue commands or to reprimand her, but simply to talk. He would find her working in the stables, or in the gardens, or even in the kitchen, helping Martha with the endless chores. He would ask her about her work, about the animals, about her thoughts on the ranch. His questions were simple, straightforward, but they were a departure from his previous, impersonal manner. Violet responded cautiously, her answers brief and guarded. She was still wary of him, still aware of his power, but she couldn't deny the flicker of curiosity that his attention sparked within her. She was beginning to see him as a complex individual, a man with a past, with emotions he kept carefully hidden. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the ranch, Violet was sitting on the porch steps, watching the twilight deepen. Slade appeared, walking towards her with his usual, measured stride. He sat down beside her, not too close, but close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the colors fade from the sky. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dust. "You remind me of her," Slade said, his voice low and quiet. Violet turned to him, her eyes questioning. "Evelyn," he said, answering her unspoken question. "You have her spirit, her resilience." Violet felt a pang of something she couldn't quite define. It wasn't pity, but rather a strange sense of empathy, of shared understanding. She had seen Evelyn's spirit in her letters, her unwavering love, her dreams for the future. And she recognized that same spirit in herself, the determination to survive, to find beauty in the midst of hardship. "She must have been a remarkable woman," Violet said, her voice soft. Slade nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "She was," he said. "She was the best part of me." He fell silent again, lost in his memories. Violet didn't press him, didn't intrude on his grief. She simply sat beside him, offering a silent presence, a shared understanding of loss. As the darkness deepened, Violet felt a flicker of defiance, a spark of resistance against the fate that had been imposed upon her. She was more than just a debt to be collected, more than just a replacement for a lost love. She was her own person, with her own thoughts, her own feelings, her own dreams. "Mr. Slade," she said, her voice firm. "I am not Evelyn." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the defiance in her gaze, the strength that had been slowly building within her. He saw the woman she was, not the ghost of the woman he had lost. He nodded slowly, a flicker of something respect, perhaps, or even admiration in his eyes. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The glimmer of defiance she showed was small, but it was there, a testament to her growing strength. The twilight conversation marked a turning point, a subtle but significant shift in their relationship, away from master and servant towards something else. Something undefined, but undeniably present. Chapter 9. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The unspoken words between Violet and Slade hung heavy in the air, creating a palpable tension that permeated their interactions. They continued their routines, the daily grind of ranch life a constant backdrop to the evolving undercurrents of their relationship. But the shared moments, the brief conversations, the subtle shifts in their behavior added layers of complexity to their already fraught dynamic. Slade's demeanor towards Violet continued to soften, his commands less harsh, his gaze less critical. He began to include her in conversations about the ranch, asking her opinion on matters of livestock, of land management, of the challenges facing the Diamondback. It was a subtle recognition of her competence, her intelligence, her inherent understanding of ranch life. Violet, in turn, responded with a cautious openness. She answered his questions thoughtfully, offering her insights, her knowledge gained from years of working alongside her father. She didn't shy away from expressing her opinions, even when they differed from Slade's. She was finding her voice, her confidence, her sense of self-worth. One afternoon, while they were riding together, checking the fences on the far reaches of the ranch, a sudden storm blew in, a violent squall that swept across the open plains. The wind howled, whipping their hair and clothes, the rain stinging their faces. They took shelter in a small, abandoned line shack, a dilapidated structure that offered minimal protection from the elements. They huddled together, their bodies close, sharing the warmth of their horses. The storm raged outside, the wind rattling the wooden walls, the rain pounding on the corrugated iron roof. The close confinement, the shared danger, heightened the tension between them. "This reminds me of the storm that took my mother," Violet said, her voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. Slade looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He had heard the story from Martha, the details of the fever that had swept through the community, taking Violet's mother and leaving her father a broken man. "You were young," he said, his voice soft. Violet nodded, her gaze fixed on the rain lashing against the small, dusty window. "I remember the fear," she said. "The feeling of helplessness." Slade reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before gently touching her arm. It was a brief, fleeting gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a gesture of comfort, of empathy, of shared understanding. Violet didn't pull away. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions: gratitude, vulnerability, and something else, something she couldn't quite define. The storm eventually passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air fresh and crisp. They emerged from the shack, the sun breaking through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the rain-soaked landscape. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the unspoken words between them heavier than ever. The shared experience, the brief moment of connection, had deepened the bond between them, but it had also heightened the awareness of their complex, unresolved relationship. The weight of those unspoken words, the emotions simmering beneath the surface, pressed down on them, a constant reminder of the chasm that still separated them and the fragile bridge that was slowly, tentatively, being built across it. The storm, both literal and metaphorical, had changed things. Chapter 10. Scars Beneath the Surface. The incident in the line shack marked a turning point, a subtle but significant shift in the unspoken dynamic between Violet and Slade. The shared vulnerability, the fleeting moment of physical contact, had created an intimacy that neither could ignore. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was a recognition of their shared humanity, their shared experiences of loss and hardship. In the days that followed, Slade began to reveal more of himself, sharing snippets of his past, his struggles, his regrets. He spoke of his early years, the hardscrabble life he had led, the constant fight for survival. He talked about his ambition, his drive to build the Diamondback into the largest, most successful ranch in the county. He spoke of his loneliness, the emptiness that had followed Evelyn's death, the void that nothing seemed to fill. Violet listened, her initial wariness slowly giving way to a growing empathy. She saw the scars beneath the surface, the emotional wounds that he kept carefully hidden. She recognized the pain in his eyes, the subtle tremor in his voice when he spoke of Evelyn, the lingering grief that he carried with him like a heavy burden. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Slade showed Violet a small, silver locket. It contained a miniature portrait of Evelyn, her face delicate and beautiful, her eyes filled with a gentle warmth. "She gave me this on our wedding day," Slade said, his voice husky with emotion. "I've never taken it off." Violet looked at the locket, at the image of the woman who had captured Slade's heart, the woman he had loved and lost. She felt a pang of sadness, not just for Slade, but for Evelyn, for the life that had been cut short, for the dreams that had been shattered. "She was beautiful," Violet said, her voice soft. Slade nodded, his gaze fixed on the locket. "She was more than beautiful," he said. "She was everything." He closed the locket, his fingers lingering on the smooth silver. He looked at Violet, his eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. "I never thought I'd feel anything again," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "After she died, I shut down. I built walls around my heart to protect myself from the pain." Violet reached out, her hand instinctively covering his. It was a gesture of comfort, of understanding, of shared grief. He didn't pull away. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "You're breaking down those walls, Violet," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "You're making me feel things I thought I'd forgotten." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Violet felt a rush of emotions: fear, confusion, and a flicker of something else, something that sent a shiver down her spine. The scars beneath the surface, both his and hers, were being exposed, raw and vulnerable. The connection between them, forged in hardship and loss, was deepening, shifting, becoming something more complex, more dangerous, more undeniable. The admission, spoken under a fading sky, was a turning point. Chapter 11. A Dance of Shadows and Secrets. The revelation of Slade's feelings, however tentative and unspoken, created a new layer of complexity in their already intricate relationship. A dance of shadows and secrets began, a delicate interplay of attraction, resistance, and the lingering presence of Evelyn's memory. Violet found herself increasingly drawn to Slade, captivated by his strength, his vulnerability, his hidden depths. She saw the man beneath the harsh exterior, the man who had loved and lost, the man who was struggling to find his way back to life. But she was also wary, aware of the power imbalance, of the debt that still bound her to him, of the ghost of Evelyn that stood between them. Slade, in turn, became more attentive, more protective, his gaze lingering on Violet, his voice softer when he spoke to her. He sought her out, creating opportunities for them to be alone, to talk, to share moments of quiet intimacy. He was drawn to her strength, her resilience, her spirit, but he was also haunted by his past, by his loyalty to Evelyn, by the guilt of feeling anything for another woman. One evening, Slade invited Violet to join him for a ride to a remote corner of the ranch, a place he called Eagle's Peak. It was a high, rocky outcrop that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape. They rode in silence, the only sounds the steady beat of the horses' hooves, the cry of a hawk circling overhead. As they reached the peak, the sun was setting, casting a breathtaking display of colors across the vast, open sky. They dismounted, standing side by side, gazing out at the vista. "It's beautiful," Violet said, her voice filled with awe. Slade nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Evelyn and I used to come here," he said, his voice soft. "It was our special place." Violet felt a pang of something she couldn't quite define. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly, but rather a sense of sadness, of intrusion, of being a shadow in someone else's story. "I understand if you don't want to share it with me," she said, her voice quiet. Slade turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "I want to share it with you, Violet," he said. "I want to make new memories." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. It was a tender gesture, a stark contrast to his previous, rough touch. Violet felt a shiver run through her, a mixture of fear and excitement. She looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability, the longing, the unspoken question. She knew what he was asking, what he was offering, and she knew that her answer would change everything. She hesitated, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She was torn between her growing feelings for Slade and the weight of her circumstances, the ghost of Evelyn, the uncertainty of the future. The secrets he held, and the ones she was beginning to keep, felt heavy. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly. She began. The dance took a decisive turn, a step toward a future as uncertain as the rugged land surrounding them. But still, no final answer was made. The hesitation hung, thick with unspoken desires and fears. Chapter 12. The Price of Loyalty and Freedom. Violet's hesitation hung in the air, a tangible representation of the complex web of emotions that entangled her and Slade. The stunning vista from Eagle's Peak, once a symbol of shared beauty and unspoken connection, now served as a backdrop to the precarious balance of their relationship. Slade waited, his hand still gently cupping her cheek, his eyes searching hers, patient yet expectant. He understood her reticence, her internal conflict. He knew the weight of her circumstances, the debt that bound her to him, the ghost of Evelyn that lingered between them. Violet looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability, the longing, but also the strength, the determination, the hint of the ruthless man she had first met. She was drawn to him, to his complexity, to the hidden depths she had glimpsed beneath his harsh exterior. But she was also afraid of surrendering her heart, of losing herself, of becoming a mere replacement for a lost love. I don't know if I can, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. It's not that simple. Slade nodded slowly, his hand dropping from her cheek. I know it's not, he said, his voice low and understanding. I'm not asking you to forget Evelyn. I'm not asking you to replace her. I'm asking you to let me in. To let's see where this goes. Violet turned away, looking out at the vast expanse of the ranch, the land that had become both her prison and her sanctuary. She thought of her father, of his debt, of the bargain that had brought her here. She thought of Evelyn, of her love for Slade, of the life they had shared. And she thought of herself, of her own desires, her own dreams, her own right to happiness. What about my father? She asked, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. What about the debt? Slade stepped closer, his presence behind her a comforting warmth. Your father's debt is my concern, he said. It doesn't have to be yours. You are not a payment, Violet. You are you. The words struck her deeply, resonating with a truth she had longed to hear. She was more than just a commodity, more than just a means to an end. She was a person, with her own worth, her own value. She turned back to him, her eyes meeting his. And what if this doesn't work? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. What if we hurt each other? Slade reached out, his hand gently taking hers. Life is full of risks, Violet, he said. But it's also full of possibilities. We can't let fear dictate our choices. We have to be brave enough to take a chance. His words resonated with her, echoing her own growing desire for freedom, for happiness, for a life beyond the confines of her circumstances. She looked into his eyes, seeing a sincerity, a vulnerability that she had never seen before. She squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of his words, of his feelings, of the precarious, uncertain future that stretched before them. She didn't give him a definitive answer, not yet. But she offered him a glimmer of hope, a willingness to explore the possibilities, to navigate the treacherous path that lay ahead. The price of loyalty, both to her father and to Evelyn's memory, warred with the price of her own freedom, her own chance at happiness. The decision, still unmade, hung between them, a silent testament to the complexities of their intertwined fates. The balance was shifting, but the final weight had yet to settle. Chapter 13. Cracks in the Facade of Stone. The tentative, unspoken agreement between Violet and Slade, born on the windswept heights of Eagle's Peak, began to subtly transform the atmosphere of the Diamondback. The rigid formality that had characterized their interactions began to soften, replaced by a cautious intimacy, a shared awareness of the shifting dynamics between them. Slade's demeanor changed noticeably. He became less the stern, demanding ranch owner and more the man Violet had glimpsed beneath the surface, vulnerable, thoughtful, and increasingly attentive to her needs and feelings. He sought her out, not to issue commands, but to engage in conversation, to share his thoughts, to listen to hers. He began to include her in decisions regarding the ranch, valuing her opinions, her insights, her knowledge of the land. Violet, in turn, responded with a growing openness, her initial wariness gradually giving way to a cautious trust. She allowed herself to see the man behind the mask, the man who had suffered loss, who carried regrets, who yearned for connection. She began to share her own thoughts and feelings more freely, expressing her opinions, her concerns, her hopes for the future. One evening, as they were working together in the stables, tending to a sick foal, Slade revealed a secret he had kept hidden for years. He told Violet about his childhood, about the poverty he had endured, the abuse he had suffered at the hands of his father. He spoke of his escape, his determination to make something of himself, to build an empire that would protect him from the vulnerabilities of his past. Violet listened, her heart aching for the young boy he had been, for the pain he had endured. She saw the cracks in the facade of stone, the emotional wounds that had shaped him, that had made him the hard, ruthless man he had become. I never told anyone this before, Slade said, his voice raw with emotion. Not even Evelyn. Violet reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. "I'm honored that you would share it with me," she said, her voice soft. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. "You make me want to be a better man, Violet," he said. "You make me want to be worthy of you." The words, spoken with such sincerity, sent a shiver down Violet's spine. She saw the depth of his feelings, the profound impact she had had on his life. She was no longer just a debt to be collected, a replacement for a lost love. She was something more, something significant. The cracks she perceived were widening, revealing a depth she hadn't anticipated. She wasn't mending him, she was allowing him to show the damage he'd carried, and that, in itself, was a form of healing. The stable, filled with the scent of hay and horses, became a sanctuary of shared vulnerability, a testament to the deepening bond between them. Chapter 14. The Howl of the Distant Storm. The growing intimacy between Violet and Slade did not go unnoticed by the inhabitants of the Diamondback. Martha, ever watchful, observed the changing dynamics with a mixture of disapproval and suspicion. The ranch hands, initially indifferent to Violet's presence, now whispered among themselves, speculating about the nature of her relationship with their employer. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with rumors and conjecture. One evening, as Violet was returning to the main house after a long day of work, she encountered Martha in the hallway. The housekeeper's face was set in its usual mask of disapproval, her eyes sharp and piercing. "Mr. Slade is a good man," Martha said, her voice low and tight. "He deserves to be happy." Violet met her gaze, her own eyes steady. "I agree," she said. Martha's lips tightened. "He's been through a lot," she continued. "He lost the love of his life. He doesn't need any more complications." Violet understood the unspoken warning, the veiled threat. Martha was fiercely loyal to Slade, protective of his well-being, and she saw Violet as a potential threat, a disruption to the fragile peace he had found. "I'm not trying to cause any complications," Violet said, her voice calm. Martha's eyes narrowed. "Don't hurt him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's been hurt enough." Violet nodded, understanding the depth of Martha's concern, the loyalty that fueled her words. She knew that her relationship with Slade was precarious, that it could easily be shattered by the weight of his past, by the expectations of others, by the inherent complexities of their situation. Later that evening, as Violet was preparing for bed, she heard a commotion outside. She looked out the window and saw a group of riders approaching the ranch, their figures silhouetted against the moonlit sky. She recognized the leader, a rival rancher named Jedediah Stone, a man known for his ruthlessness and his long-standing feud with Slade. The distant storm, metaphorically brewing for months, was about to break. Jed Stone, and the long-simmering feud with his family, represented more than just a business rivalry. He was a physical embodiment of the past, a reminder of the violent undercurrents that ran through the seemingly peaceful landscape. Violet's heart pounded in her chest. She knew that Stone's arrival boded ill, that it threatened the fragile peace of the Diamondback, that it could jeopardize her own precarious position. She quickly dressed, pulling on her boots and grabbing a shawl. She had to warn Slade. The howl of the distant storm, in the form of approaching riders and a long-standing feud, was about to engulf them all. Chapter 15. Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. Violet raced through the darkened house, her heart pounding in her chest. She found Slade in his study, poring over maps and ledgers, the lamplight casting long shadows across his face. "Slade," she exclaimed, her voice breathless. "Jed Stone is here. He's riding in with a group of men." Slade looked up, his eyes instantly alert, his expression hardening. He rose from his chair, his movements swift and decisive. "How many?" he asked, his voice sharp. "At least a dozen," Violet replied. "Maybe more." Slade swore under his breath. He knew Stone's reputation, his ruthlessness, his long-standing desire to acquire the Diamondback. He had been expecting trouble, had been preparing for it, but he hadn't anticipated it would come so soon, so brazenly. "Get Martha and the other women to the cellar," he ordered. "Stay there until I tell you it's safe." "What about you?" Violet asked, her voice filled with concern. I'll handle Stone, Slade said, his voice grim. He strapped on his gun belt, his movements practiced and efficient. He was a man accustomed to violence, to defending his territory, to protecting what was his. Violet hesitated. She didn't want to leave him, to face Stone alone. She wanted to stand by his side, to fight alongside him. Go, Violet, Slade said, his voice firm. This is my fight. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. Be careful, he said, his voice soft. Violet nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. She watched him go, her heart aching with a sense of foreboding. She knew that this confrontation could change everything, that it could shatter the fragile peace they had found, that it could cost them everything. She quickly gathered Martha and the other women, leading them to the cellar beneath the house, a dark, damp space that offered a semblance of safety. They huddled together, listening to the sounds of the approaching riders, the shouts, the gunshots that erupted outside. Violet felt trapped, caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. She was torn between her loyalty to Slade, her growing feelings for him, and her fear for his safety, for her own future, for the fate of the Diamondback. The confrontation was not just about land or cattle, it was about power, about revenge, about the past catching up to the present. And she was caught in the middle, her own destiny intertwined with the outcome of the battle raging outside. The cellar, a place of supposed refuge, felt like a cage, the sounds of violence echoing her own internal turmoil. Chapter 16. A flicker of hope in the darkness. The sounds of the battle raged outside, a cacophony of gunshots, shouts, and the thundering of hooves. Violet and the other women huddled in the cellar, their faces pale with fear, their hearts pounding in their chests. The darkness pressed in on them, amplifying their anxiety, their sense of helplessness. Violet paced restlessly, her mind racing, her imagination conjuring images of the violence unfolding above. She worried about Slade, about his safety, about the possibility of losing him, of losing everything. She had come to care for him deeply, to see beyond his harsh exterior, to recognize the vulnerable, wounded man beneath. Hours passed, an eternity of waiting, of listening, of fearing the worst. The sounds of the fighting gradually subsided, replaced by an eerie silence that was almost more terrifying than the noise. Violet strained her ears, trying to discern any sound that might indicate the outcome of the confrontation. Finally, she heard footsteps approaching the cellar door. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and dread. She held her breath, waiting, praying that it was Slade, that he was safe. The door creaked open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the dim light filtering down from above. It was Slade. He was covered in dust and grime, his clothes torn, a streak of blood on his cheek. But he was alive. Violet rushed to him, her arms wrapping around him in a fierce embrace. She felt his body tremble, his ragged breathing, the tension that still gripped him. Are you all right? She asked, her voice choked with emotion. He nodded, his arms tightening around her. It's over, he said, his voice hoarse. Stone is gone. We drove them off. Relief washed over Violet, a wave of emotion so intense that it left her weak. She clung to him, her tears wetting his shirt. He held her close, his hand stroking her hair, his presence a comforting reassurance. The other women emerged from the cellar, their faces etched with relief and gratitude. They had survived. The Diamondback had been defended. The immediate threat had passed. As the adrenaline subsided, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The ranch had suffered damage, several of the outbuildings had been burned, and some of the livestock had been lost. But the main house had been spared, and more importantly, no lives had been lost on their side. Slade, despite his exhaustion and his injuries, immediately took charge, directing the ranch hands to assess the damage, to tend to the injured animals, to begin the process of rebuilding. He was a leader, a protector, a man who inspired loyalty and respect. Violet watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of admiration and love. She had seen his strength, his courage, his unwavering determination. She had also seen his vulnerability, his fear, his humanity. As the dawn broke, casting a soft, golden light over the battered ranch, Violet saw a flicker of hope in the darkness. The battle had been won, the threat had been repelled. But more importantly, the bond between her and Slade had been forged in the crucible of conflict, strengthened by shared danger, by mutual respect, by a love that had blossomed amidst the ashes of violence and uncertainty. It was a fragile hope, a tentative beginning, but it was there, a promise of a future they might build together. The damage was real, but so, too, was the resilience of the land and the people who called it home. Chapter 17. The Unraveling of Twisted Truths. The Aftermath of the Attack, by Jed Stone, left the Diamondbacks scarred but not broken. The ranch hands worked tirelessly to repair the damage, to rebuild the fences, to tend to the injured livestock. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and sweat, a tangible reminder of the violence that had transpired. Slade, despite his own exhaustion and injuries, remained a constant presence, overseeing the recovery efforts, offering encouragement, his leadership a beacon of hope amidst the devastation. He was visibly shaken by the confrontation, by the near loss of everything he had built, but he refused to show weakness, to let his fear dictate his actions. Violet, too, threw herself into the recovery efforts, working alongside the ranch hands, offering her assistance wherever it was needed. She was determined to help rebuild, to contribute to the restoration of the Diamondback, to show Slade her unwavering support. One afternoon, as Violet was cleaning out the debris from one of the burned-out buildings, she stumbled upon a small, metal box hidden beneath a pile of charred timber. It was locked, but the key was lying nearby, partially melted but still functional. Curiosity overcame her, and she unlocked the box. Inside, she found a collection of documents, letters, and a faded photograph. The documents detailed a series of land transactions, agreements, and legal disputes between the Slade and Stone families, dating back several generations. The letters were filled with accusations, threats, and expressions of hatred and resentment. The photograph showed a young Beau Slade standing beside a stern-faced man she recognized as his father, and a younger Jed Stone with his own father, a mirror image of animosity. As Violet examined the contents of the box, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The long-standing feud between the two families was not simply a matter of competing business interests, as she had been led to believe. It was rooted in a deep-seated betrayal, a twisted web of lies, deceit, and stolen land. She discovered that Slade's father had cheated Stone's father out of a significant portion of his land, using forged documents and legal maneuvering to acquire it unjustly. The Stones had never forgotten, had never forgiven, and the feud had been passed down through the generations, fueled by a burning desire for revenge. Violet realized that Slade was unaware of the true origins of the feud, that he had been living a lie, fighting a battle based on false pretenses. She knew that she had to tell him, to reveal the truth, however painful it might be. The twisted truths unraveled before her, painted a picture far more complex than the simple rivalry she'd understood. It was a legacy of injustice, and she held the key to exposing it. The discovery, hidden amongst the ashes, was about to change everything again. Chapter 18. Where Rivers of Resentment Run Deep. Finding the right moment to reveal the contents of the metal box to Slade proved difficult. He was consumed with the rebuilding efforts, his mind focused on restoring the Diamondback to its former glory. He was also dealing with the emotional aftermath of the attack, the lingering tension, the constant vigilance required to protect his land and his people. Violet waited, her anxiety growing with each passing day. She knew that the truth would be painful, that it would shatter Slade's perception of his father, of his family legacy, of the feud that had shaped his life. But she also knew that he deserved to know, that he had a right to understand the true origins of the conflict, to make his own choices based on truth, not lies. Finally, one evening, as they were sitting together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and red, Violet decided to speak. She had the metal box with her, its contents a heavy weight in her lap. Slade, she began, her voice hesitant, I need to show you something. He turned to her, his eyes questioning, a flicker of concern in their depths. She opened the box, revealing the documents, the letters, the faded photograph. She explained what she had found, how she had discovered the truth about the origins of the feud, the betrayal perpetrated by his father. As Slade listened, his expression changed, shifting from disbelief to anger, to a deep, profound sadness. He took the documents in his hands, his fingers tracing the faded ink, his eyes scanning the words that revealed the lies he had lived with for so long. I don't believe it, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. My father, he wouldn't. I know it's hard to accept, Violet said, her voice soft. But the evidence is here, in these documents, in these letters. He looked at the photograph, at the image of his father, a man he had idolized, a man he had believed to be honorable and just. He saw the truth in the faded image, the arrogance, the ruthlessness, the seeds of the conflict that had consumed his life. He closed his eyes, his body trembling with the force of his emotions. The rivers of resentment, he realized, ran far deeper than he had ever imagined, fed by a source he had never suspected. The foundation of his life, his beliefs, his understanding of his own family, was crumbling beneath him. All these years, he said, his voice barely a whisper. All the fighting, the hatred, the bloodshed, it was all based on a lie. Violet reached out, her hand gently covering his. I'm so sorry, Slade, she said. I know this is painful. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and gratitude. Thank you, Violet, he said, for telling me the truth, for not keeping it from me. The porch, their usual sanctuary of quiet evenings, became the stage for a profound unraveling, a moment of devastating truth that changed the landscape of their lives. Chapter 19. A Reckoning Under the Desert Sky. The revelation of his father's betrayal sent Slade spiraling into a vortex of conflicting emotions. He wrestled with anger, shame, grief, and a profound sense of disillusionment. The man he had idolized, the man he had striven to emulate, had been a liar, a cheat, a man who had built his empire on stolen land. He spent days poring over the documents, rereading the letters, examining the faded photograph, trying to reconcile the image of his father he had held in his heart with the reality revealed by the evidence. He questioned everything he had believed, everything he had fought for, everything he had built his life upon. Violet remained by his side, offering silent support, a comforting presence amidst the storm raging within him. She understood his pain, his confusion, his need to grapple with the truth, to come to terms with the shattered illusions of his past. One evening, Slade rode out to Eagle's Peak, the place where he had shared his most intimate memories with Violet, the place where he had first confessed his feelings for her. He stood on the rocky outcrop, gazing out at the vast expanse of the Diamondback, the land that had been both his blessing and his curse. He thought of his father, of his legacy of lies and deceit. He thought of Jedstone, of the generations of hatred and violence that had stemmed from his father's actions. He thought of Evelyn, of the love he had lost, of the life he had tried to rebuild. And he thought of Violet, of her strength, her honesty, her unwavering support, of the love that had blossomed amidst the ruins of his past. He realized that he had a choice to make. He could continue to perpetuate the cycle of violence and revenge, to cling to the false legacy of his father. Or he could break free, forge a new path, build a future based on truth, on justice, on love. As the sun set, casting a fiery glow across the desert sky, Slade made his decision. He would not be defined by his father's sins. He would not let hatred and resentment consume him. He would find a way to make amends, to heal the wounds of the past, to build a future worthy of Violet's love. He rode back to the ranch, his heart filled with a newfound resolve, a determination to confront the consequences of his father's actions, to seek reconciliation, to create a new legacy for the Diamondback. The reckoning under the desert sky was not just with the past, but with himself, with the man he wanted to be, with the future he wanted to create. It was a turning point, a moment of profound transformation, fueled by truth and driven by a love that had blossomed amidst the thorns of a bitter inheritance. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Slade's decision to break the cycle of violence and seek reconciliation with the Stone family was met with resistance and skepticism. The ranch hands, accustomed to the long-standing feud, struggled to understand his change of heart. Martha, fiercely loyal to Slade and his family legacy, openly questioned his sanity. But Slade was resolute. He knew that the only way to heal the wounds of the past, to build a lasting peace, was to confront the Stones directly, to offer amends, to seek a resolution that would benefit both families. He sent a message to Jed Stone, requesting a meeting, a parley to discuss the terms of a truce, a potential settlement of the long-standing land dispute. Stone, initially suspicious, eventually agreed, driven by his own weariness of the endless conflict, by the realization that the feud had cost both families dearly. The meeting took place at a neutral location, a small, abandoned church on the border between the two ranches Slade and Violet rode together, accompanied by a small contingent of his most trusted ranch hands. Stone arrived with a similar escort, his face grim, his eyes wary. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with generations of hatred, of mistrust, of unspoken grievances. Slade, his voice calm and steady, laid out his proposal. He acknowledged his father's wrongdoing, the injustice perpetrated against the Stone family. He offered to return a portion of the disputed land, to compensate the Stones for their losses, to establish a joint venture that would benefit both ranches. Stone listened, his expression unreadable, his body language tense and guarded. He questioned Slade's motives, his sincerity, his ability to control his own people, to overcome the deeply ingrained animosity that had defined their relationship for so long. Violet, standing by Slade's side, spoke up, her voice clear and strong. She shared her own story, her initial perception of Slade, her discovery of the truth, her belief in his genuine desire for peace. She spoke of the futility of the feud, of the toll it had taken on both families, of the need to break the cycle of violence, to build a future based on cooperation, not conflict. Her words, spoken with passion and conviction, resonated with Stone. He saw her sincerity, her courage, her unwavering belief in Slade's transformation. He saw the possibility of a different future, a future free from the hatred and violence that had plagued his family for generations. After hours of tense negotiations, of heated arguments, of grudging concessions, an agreement was reached. The land dispute would be settled, a truce would be declared, a joint venture would be established. The feud, which had spanned generations, which had cost countless lives and caused untold suffering, was finally coming to an end. As the sun set, casting a long, golden shadow over the two ranches, Slade and Stone shook hands, a symbolic gesture of reconciliation, of a new beginning. It was a fragile peace, a tentative truce, but it was a start. The final confrontation was not one of violence, but of hearts and horizons, a testament to the power of truth, of forgiveness, of the courage to choose a different path. It was a victory, not just for Slade and Violet, but for both families, for the entire community, for the future of the land they shared. It was not an ending, but a beginning. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the transformative power of love, forgiveness, and the courage to forge a new path. The Diamondback and the Stone Ranch, once bitter rivals, became partners, their combined resources creating a thriving enterprise that benefited the entire community. Slade and Violet, their bond forged in the crucible of conflict and strengthened by shared hardship, built a life together, a life filled with love, respect, and a deep, abiding commitment to each other and to the land they shared. They had children, a new generation raised without the burden of the old feud, a generation taught the values of cooperation, of understanding, of peaceful resolution. The scars of the past remained, visible reminders of the violence and the hatred that had once consumed their families. But the wounds had healed, replaced by a sense of shared purpose, a commitment to building a better future. Violet often visited Eagle's Peak, the place where Slade had first confessed his feelings for her, the place where they had made the decision to break the cycle of violence. She would stand on the rocky outcrop, gazing out at the vast expanse of the ranch, the land that had once been a symbol of conflict, now a testament to the power of reconciliation. Slade, his hair now streaked with silver, his face lined with the wisdom of years, would often join her, his hand gently taking hers, their fingers intertwined, a symbol of their enduring love, their unwavering commitment. They had faced down outlaws, weathered storms, and confronted the demons of the past. They had found love amidst hardship, hope amidst despair, and peace amidst the ashes of a bitter feud. Their story, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, became a legend, whispered across the vast, open plains, a reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, love could blossom, forgiveness could triumph, and a new dawn could break, even after the darkest of nights. The legacy they built was not one of land and cattle, but of healing, of unity, and of a love that had conquered all. It was a legacy that would endure, long after they were gone, a beacon of hope for generations to come.